In a world that worshipped the Eye of Ra, some of its most sacred voices didn't see a thing. Ancient Egypt was a civilization built for the eyes, towering obelisks, painted tombs, gods with eyeliner so sharp it could part the Nile. If you couldn't see all that, well, what good were you? Turns out, maybe quite a lot. Because while most people were busy admiring golden statues and reading messages carved into cliffs, there was another group, smaller, quieter, and very much unseeing, who were playing music for the gods, literally. This isn't some sentimental fairy tale. It's in the tombs, blind harpists, temple musicians, spirit chanters with no need for visuals, just memory, rhythm, and an ear for the divine. In ancient Egypt, being blind didn't mean useless. Sometimes it meant sacred. Sometimes it got you a job. And sometimes it got your face painted on the wall next to a guy with a leopard skin kilt and a giant staff. This is the story of blindness in ancient Egypt, of lost eyes, sacred songs, salty eye ointments, and a world where not seeing didn't mean not mattering. And by the end of this, you might wonder if the people with no vision actually saw more than anyone else. In ancient Egypt, there was no medical term for visually impaired. You were either someone who could see or someone who couldn't. And that was it. No categories, no diagnoses, just a social question. What could you still do? Because blindness, while inconvenient, wasn't necessarily disqualifying. Egypt wasn't handing out disability pensions, but it also wasn't throwing every blind person into a ditch. In a world obsessed with utility and cosmic balance, being blind didn't automatically strip you of worth. It just made your usefulness harder to prove. If you were blind but talented, cooperative, or born into the right household, you still had options. If you weren't, well, the desert is large and compassion has limits. Class mattered. A blind noble might have servants to help him function. A blind commoner. Maybe a stick. Maybe a sibling. Maybe nothing. But what stands out is that blindness didn't make someone invisible. Quite the opposite. We have tomb art to prove they were seen. Take the tomb of Paheri, a 17th dynasty official buried in El Kab. Among the colourful scenes of farming and feasting, there's a simple image, a man leading another by a stick. The second man is blind, his eyes sunken, his gait careful. He's not mocked, not beaten, just there, represented. That's important. Ancient art didn't waste space. Tomb walls weren't scrapbooks. They were eternal resumes. If someone made it onto the wall, they mattered, even a little, which means that somewhere in Paheri's world, a blind man had a place. Maybe as a servant, maybe as a singer, maybe just as someone who lived long enough to be noticed. And he's not alone. Similar figures pop up in other tombs too. Blind men with canes, being led, being helped. Always on the periphery, but present. They weren't center stage, but they weren't erased either. That tells us something uncomfortable and honest about how the Egyptians saw blindness. Not as a tragedy, but as a limitation. A manageable one, if you were lucky. A fatal one, if you weren't. Egypt didn't pity you for losing your sight. It pitied you for not being useful afterward. In a culture where your value was tied to what you produced, be it grain, linen, or praise for the gods, losing your vision meant one thing: you'd better find another way to contribute, fast. If you were blind in ancient Egypt and wanted to survive, or, better yet, be invited to dinner, there was one golden ticket. Be good with a harp. Not just passable, not my cousin plays a little. You had to be exceptional, because in elite Egyptian society, harpists weren't background noise. They were part of the performance, the ancient equivalent of live jazz at a 5-star dinner, except the food came with beer, honey-roasted duck, and a statue of Osiris judging your afterlife prospects in the corner. Some of the best visual records we have of blind individuals aren't in hospitals or begging scenes. They're in feasts. Specifically, scenes carved into the tombs of high-ranking officials like Antifoca and Nacht, where blind harpists sit cross-legged in flowing white linen, fingers dancing across elegant curved harps. Eyes closed, back straight, completely unbothered by the chaos around them. These weren't casual jam sessions. The harpists were deliberately placed, centered in the composition, facing noble guests, often mid-song. It's clear they weren't there out of pity. They were there because they were good. And let's be honest, blindness probably helped. No eye contact, no awkward glances at someone's spilled wine, no risk of flinching at a priest sneezing into his lentils. Just sacred ambience and perfectly timed plucks. The ultimate dinner party, low maintenance, high vibes. Instruments included arched harps, short lyres, and occasionally sistrums, though the harp was king. Often made of imported wood with polished curves. These weren't scrap instruments. They were handcrafted status symbols. A good harpist knew not just the rhythm, but the room, when to play soft, when to rise, and when to let a noble's toast take center stage. These musicians weren't part of the priesthood or spiritual order. We'll get there later. They were entertainers, working-class performers who'd earned a place in high society, not because of who they were, but because of what they could make people feel, and the fact that they were blind. It might have even added mystique. Oh yes, our harpist tonight doesn't see the world, he feels it. A proto-poetic touch that made the nobles feel deeper just by association. There's no record of their names, no celebrity endorsements, but their images were carved into stone, right next to the people who paid for the tomb. That's not a coincidence, it's a signal. The rich wanted to be remembered with their music. So while other blind people may have been swept to the edge of society, the harpist got a seat at the table, sometimes literally. Because in ancient Egypt, if you couldn't see but you could play, you were still very much worth looking at. And really, it's hard to upstage a blind man playing a 10-stringed harp in a room full of dancers, beer, and freshly slaughtered ox, especially if he hits every note and doesn't spill his drink. Let's talk logistics. Because being blind in ancient Egypt wasn't all banquet gigs and harp solos. For most people, especially commoners, life was dusty, loud, crowded, and aggressively unaccommodating. Picture it. Narrow alleys crammed with vendors, livestock, pottery shards, and the occasional ceremonial goose. No sidewalks, no signage, no safety railings, just blazing sun, loose bricks, and somewhere nearby, a baboon doing something illegal. Now take away your vision. Daily survival meant adaptation and help if you could get it. Tomb art shows blind individuals being led by the hand or guided by sticks, usually by children or younger relatives. It's one of the few forms of disability support we actually see depicted. No canes, no guide dogs, just good old-fashioned grab the kid and go. The urban blind, especially those with families, had a better shot. Cities meant more people, more noise to navigate by, and more chances to find some kind of work, however modest. Maybe you became a household helper, or someone's extra set of ears in the market. Maybe you begged. Maybe you listened, memorized, repeated, and carved out a niche with your mouth instead of your hands. In rural areas, though, things got rough. Villages were smaller, poorer, and far less forgiving. Farm labor didn't exactly lend itself to low-vision execution. Try milking a cow you can't see, or harvesting grain next to a canal full of crocodiles. And forget wandering outside after dark. Torches were for gods and funerals, not your evening stroll. The poor blind had little to fall back on. No royal patrons, no carved harps. Just a very practical question. Can you help, or are you one more mouth to feed? There's no evidence of systematic abandonment, but there's no record of a blind peasant being commemorated on a wall either. So we're left to assume that unless you were useful, in whatever way that meant, you faded into the background. Still, the fact that some blind people did make it into tomb scenes means that disability didn't erase a person entirely. Egypt wasn't egalitarian, but it wasn't blind to effort. If you contributed, even in a small way, you might just earn a place. In memory, if not comfort. And then there were the hazards. Ancient Egypt was full of beautifully carved dangers, snakes, uneven temple steps, low ceilings, sacred cats with attitude problems. Tripping over a feline in your own home could be both a household hazard and an omen, especially if that cat was sacred to Bastet. The last thing you want is to offend a goddess with claws and fanatical followers. So no, being blind in ancient Egypt wasn't easy. But it wasn't always the end. For some, it was just a very complicated new route to relevance, navigated one cautious step at a time. In a land where gods wore animal heads and justice was measured by the weight of a feather, blindness didn't just mean physical loss. It could signal something deeper, something divine. The Egyptians didn't separate the body from the spirit the way we do today. Every illness, deformity, or accident had potential meaning. And losing your sight wasn't just bad luck, it was transformation. Take Horus, for example, the falcon-headed god of kingship and the sky. In one version of his myth, during a battle with Set, Horus loses his left eye. That eye later becomes the Wadjet, or Eye of Horus, a powerful symbol of healing, protection, and restoration. The eye is damaged, but its absence gives it meaning. What was lost becomes a symbol of vision greater than vision, the kind that sees beyond the battlefield. That's the mythology. But on the ground, in temples and rituals, blindness may have carried similar symbolic weight. If you couldn't see the material world, maybe it meant you were closer to the immaterial one. There's no scroll that confirms blind priests only, but the pattern is hard to ignore. Certain rituals required intense repetition, long chants, sensory focus, all skills a blind person might develop to survive. In a dark, incense-filled sanctuary where sound mattered more than sight, a person with no visual distractions might have been ideal. Blindness also suggested purity by limitation, a kind of forced detachment from worldly illusion. You didn't see corruption, vanity, temptation, or imperfection. You heard, you remembered, you felt, and that gave you power, or at least the illusion of it. Which, in religion, often amounts to the same thing. Across cultures, the blind seer is a recurring figure, from Tiresias in Greece to prophets in desert caves. Those without sight often claim to see more than anyone else. Ancient Egypt was no different. It just carved its visions in stone and added a linen kilt. And perhaps, most ironically of all, blindness in Egypt may have inverted the spiritual hierarchy. While the elite decorated their tombs with visual splendor, carvings, colors, hieroglyphs begging for eternity, the blind person, unable to see any of it, may have focused instead on what couldn't be painted: memory, sound, spirit. In that way, blindness wasn't just a condition, it was a perspective. Inconvenient, yes, but also uniquely tuned to a world that believed life was only the first act. For all its grandeur, ancient Egypt was not kind to the human eye. Between the desert winds, constant sun glare, smoke from cooking fires, and sandstorms that felt personal, ocular health was optimistic at best. Blindness had plenty of causes: chronic infections like trachoma were common, highly contagious, and likely to spread in tight family homes with limited hygiene. Cataracts developed early from UV exposure. Add in the occasional blunt trauma from farming tools, donkey kicks, or falling roof tiles, and you had a society with no shortage of vision problems. But the Egyptians didn't just shrug and accept it, they tried to fix it with enthusiasm and onions. So many onions. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts in existence, contains over 100 treatments for eye conditions alone. Some are surprisingly logical, herbal salves made from honey and crushed herbs, both of which have antimicrobial properties. Others were less so. Example. For treating eye discharge, one recipe suggests mixing pig's eye, red ochre, honey, and green eye paint applied with a reed. For inflammation, try crocodile dung applied directly, not metaphorically, directly, and if that doesn't work, there's always the option to recite a spell over the mixture first. Because if you're going to smear animal feces on your face, it might as well be blessed. Tombs of doctors and temple healers have yielded actual eye medicine tools. Bronze spatulas, pestles, and tiny containers used for grinding and applying ointments. These weren't for show. Someone was really out there rubbing garlic paste into someone else's cornea and calling it healthcare. And yet, this wasn't madness. It was method. They had a theory. Disease was caused by blockages, spirits, or imbalances. So they treated it with a mix of natural remedies, ritual words, and whatever local animal part they hadn't run out of. Imagine going blind in the year 1400 BCE and being told the cure is garlic, honey, and the eye of a lizard. Not eaten, of course, just gently mashed and rubbed on your eyelid by a priest who also doubles as a pharmacist and part-time astrologer. In their defense, honey is antimicrobial, and so is onion, sort of. It's the dung, chalk, and antelope bile that really pushes the limits of medical optimism. But here's the important part. They tried. Blindness wasn't ignored. It was treated energetically, consistently, and with an ancient version of scientific faith. They didn't always get it right. In fact, they rarely did. But they didn't give up on the eyes, even when the eyes had clearly given up on them. Welcome to ancient Egyptian ophthalmology, where vision met vinegar, and no one blinked. The irony is hard to ignore. Thousands of years later, most of the healthy, able-bodied elites of Egypt, the scribes, the merchants, the minor priests, have vanished from memory. But the blind harpists, they're still here, not in flesh, of course, but in stone, carved into the tombs of men whose names barely ring a bell, playing songs we'll never hear, preserved not because they ruled, but because they played. That's the legacy. The unseeing performer, sitting cross-legged with an oversized harp, eyes closed, head tilted, caught mid-song in a scene meant to last eternity, somewhere between a servant and a symbol, not royalty, not clergy, just someone who did one thing well enough to be remembered. In a culture obsessed with order, with cosmic balance and social roles, blindness could have been an automatic erasure. But it wasn't. Sometimes it was a doorway. Not an easy one, not even a fair one, but a possible one. Today, we tend to frame blindness as a deficit, a loss that defines everything else about a person. But ancient Egypt didn't always see it that way. It saw the inconvenience, yes, the limitations, but it also saw the person behind it, or at least the function, the sound, the memory, the value. You didn't have to fight in wars or build pyramids to make it into history. Sometimes all you had to do was sit still, pluck the right string, and make the afterlife feel just a little more beautiful for someone else. And if that meant you couldn't see the carving they made of you later, well, that was never the point. Blindness in ancient Egypt wasn't simple. It could be feared. It could be sacred. It could push you to the edge of society, or bring you to the center of a feast. There were no braille tablets, no accommodations, and yet, in a world designed to be seen, the people who couldn't were sometimes the ones remembered longest. While scribes faded and noble names were chipped away by time, the blind harpist still sits there, carved in stone, mid-song, eyes closed, immortal not for what he saw, but for what others heard. Egypt worshipped the eye, but, ironically, it was sound, not sight, that gave some blind Egyptians a place in history vision never could. If this gave you a new perspective on ancient Egypt, or just made you think twice about how we define ability, go ahead and give it a like. And if you want more history that flips expectations and dusts off the forgotten, hit subscribe. We're just getting started, because sometimes the ones who couldn't see left the clearest mark.